for all kind of artists, really, all part. And Richard and Sonia and Patrick and Hans. And Patrick and Hans run this saturation point space. And so this is an opportunity to put some work up, have a chat about it, and then you run it as an online archive or repository of it all, don't you? So we're going to then document it. So this is part of the documentation of it, so that then it will be there in perpetuity, potentially. So thank you for the opportunity.
For the millions out there that are going to watch this and don't know who I am, I'm just going to say who I am. My name is Richard Ducker, and I met Robert through one of his ALL projects. Was it 2011? I was trying to...
Could have been, it was a little while ago.
It was a while ago. Then we got together, and I can't remember exactly how or who instigated it, but it doesn't really matter. We got together and did a joint project at Cable Depot last year and early part of this year. And we did that because we were both working with found text online. And so we had this common interest in both the way we kind of are currently constructed through and by our online experience, and wanted to interrogate that through the use of text. So we did this joint project at Cable Depot. So that is why I am here asking the questions, because we do have a common background. It's not completely random. So I just wanted to put that into context. So I have 20 questions for you here.
Fantastic.
And your starter for 10
okay.
is, okay, so the title of the exhibition is What If This Is Who We Are? Which suggests a rather depressing view of humanity. Are you that pessimistic?
No, I think is the short answer. Funny enough, I don't think of it as a pessimistic outlook. So it's a number of different works that are reflecting back the internet and Google News and the information overload, the deluge of stuff that we're being invited to process and being constantly reminded of. And well, first of all, what if this is who we are? Is not it's a proposition. Mm-hmm. It's a possibility. Well, maybe this is who we are. It's not saying this is who we are. So it's more propositional than that. It's more it's a starter for 10 in a way, saying, well, what can we make of all of this? What can we make of all this? And maybe it is who we are. Maybe it's not. But it's an offer, something to put out there and maybe to consider. But whether it's pessimistic or not, I think is what each of us bring to the party. It's neither optimistic nor pessimistic. It's a statement, and maybe we project onto it.
Yeah. Yes, but the statement of what you've selected is quite. There's a sense of urgency about it all, which implies that there is a kind of terror at work. And I wonder if this is who we are, then it is quite bleak. If the answer to the proposition is this
yes.
is it.
Maybe. I think also in some of the blurb that I've written about it, I talk about it being a moment of zen and a chance to stand back. And actually, I think in a way, by stilling it, by freezing all this constant refresh of information, by freezing it in the instant and being able to step back from it, it allows us to get a bit of distance on it, a bit of awareness, and actually a period in which we can reflect about it, but also to not give ourselves such a hard time. Maybe if this is how we are and this is how humans are, then actually, well, we're kind of doing the best we can, maybe. There's a sense in which that so much of life is so complex and also so contradictory. You know, so many, I don't think there's a one right answer or one way of looking at as us as individuals or society as a whole. These problems, you know, the human condition has been around for so long, it's not going to be solved anytime soon. So maybe that gives us a little bit of a leeway to not be quite so hard on ourselves.
Okay. So maybe before we go on any further, you give us a very short introduction of what's on show.
Sure.
Just so that we have some reference points.
So I've got a number of related works here which are all thinking about the online experience, and particular reference to Google, but also to other news sources. I'm fascinated by the way in which knowledge has moved from books to the internet, from Encyclopedia Britannica, as it were, to Wikipedia, and what that means. And now we've just got such a superabundance of material, it's difficult to process. So each of them is a means to try and consider them. So around the wall, for example, I've got some of the early texts from when the outbreak first started, and now it's about 18 months, 2 years ago. There's a way in which we can reflect back and look at it and get a sense of distance on it, and maybe see it for what it is. The Google alerts that are streaming down are all of a piece, inviting us to kind of consider the answer to different questions. And again, it's just a torrent of information that's been almost frozen in time and allows us to give it some thought. And then on the monitor at the back, I've got some headlines from the Daily Mail news feed, and they're all to do with Love Island. So all of the texts about the Love Island series are just flickering out on the internet, on the monitor. So they're all different approaches to the same online material.
Okay. We both, as I said at the beginning, found text from the online source. But whereas I tend to use it to suggest narratives, to elicit maybe an emotional response, you seem to be more interested in categories and systems and patterns. Can you explain or just delve into your working process a little bit, and how an idea begins, and where you kind of want it to go?
Well, I definitely think of a lot of what I do as we just got an ice cream van. Maybe we should go and get an ice cream. I think of my work as almost kind of propositional. I'm interested in getting to the bottom of things. I kind of want answers, but I know I'm not going to get them. So my work is reflecting back, I think, what I'm seeing and experiencing as starting points. So it's not a poetic or a narrative. I'm not trying to construct a narrative. I'm trying to offer things for reflection, and that's a way of trying to make sense of things. So strategies such as categorizing things or grouping things together or presenting them in a particular way externalizes them to us and allows us then to consider, what it is, what the nature of the beast is. So I don't want to personally add particularly a narrative or a poetic to it, so much as to extract and present for consideration.
But go back a stage further and try and tell me how you alight upon something. What is it that sort of ignites your imagination about why this is something you want to
that's part
extract and investigate?
Sure. Partly that's the kind of million-dollar question: is what drives us as artists, or what is it that makes us want to do things? For me, as I say, it's about wanting to get to the bottom of things and knowledge, and the internet and Google. Google, one of its early claims was organising the world or something. It was going to kind of have basically everything, all the knowledge in one place. So, hey presto, we've got this fantastic resource of everything. And it would take too many lifetimes to understand all of the stuff that's therein. So it's an attempt to sieve or to kind of extract or to use that as a way of identifying. But then within that, which bits of it that I'm choosing, there is a personal element to it. I mean, it's not a completely closed strategy. It's not a completely scientific and objective approach. They are quirky sometimes to me and to my own. You know, I see something and I want to pursue it. So it falls short of being a completely objective laying out of the online environment. It is a selected approach.
Okay, so that selection process and what you do with it, would you see it as something that's quite systemic, as a way of thinking about it? And do you think that's why Saturation Point wanted to put on, host this exhibition? I mean, what do you feel you have that connects you in a way with their agenda? Well, maybe they should answer that.
Well, I was going to say maybe that would definitely be one.
But
a nice one.
Hear it from you first, maybe.
Sure, but definitely there's the sense of analytics, and there's definitely some systems and categorization and repetition and form that's involved. Those are all important to me, and quite a minimal approach to stripping out what's not essential to the piece itself. And then the other thing is a lot of the texts have very specific rhythms or cadences or particularities to them. Different texts have different kind of rhythms and characteristics, and those are things that also I'm wanting to explore through it. So those are things that I'm doing with text that may be being done in other ways through other artists at Saturation Point.
Would you want to add anything as to why you felt? Because on the surface, I'm now talking to Hans and Patrick off camera, but on the surface of it, in a way, this is quite a different move from what you would normally put on, in the sense that it's normally painting based, I would say, or yes, two-dimensional based. So
it was the fact that we use the numerical and visual keys, whereas this is using words and sentences and manipulating them and hanging them. So it had something that grabbed us when we first saw it at the washing line exhibition. That crumbs, that's a different way of using sentences.
Yeah.
So it's very different. But there is that kind of crossover, the use of written word material, data. We use a lot of data in our work, so this is just different data. It just kind of chimed with us.
I mean, I can see it actually.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that different. It's just formally it's
yes,
different.
Yeah.
That's true.
So I just want to stay on the category a little bit longer, because
sure,
I feel like we can drill a bit further down into this. So the question I've got here is: the choice of topic often appears as a form of category, as if you're trying to catalogue our online presence. And my curiosity is whether this is a deliberately futile endeavour, like Borges's library, or some kind of attempt to make sense. And it could be both, actually, I suppose. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive.
I don't see it as cataloguing, although my breaking book was a year's worth of Google News headlines. Every day for a year, I collected the headlines that Google offered me, and I alphabetized them and made them into book form. That was my first attempt to stand back from the offer that Google was giving me, and that's the closest I think I've come to a catalogue. Of course, that's very partial, it's very personal, because it's just whatever they gave to me, and it was, but it's not exhaustive. And then since then, none of the other work is really exhaustive. I suppose the COVID headlines, I do automate now that process of collection. So every day I get stuff from Google is sent to me, so I have it as an archive. And then that predated COVID, the COVID outbreak, and I realised that I had by chance this perfect record of every headline about COVID since it started. And so I've got that archive record. But in general, it's not so much about categorising, it's much more about making sense and the propositional element. So it falls short. I'll stop once I feel I've got enough to give me a flavour or enough to kind of crunch against, rather than it could. Plus, it could keep going forever.
That's the other option, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So, I mean, you've got essentially mostly news-based stuff, and then you have, and I use the word news in inverted commas because it's hard to know what constitutes news anymore. And then you have the Daily Mail's feed on Love Island, which some would see as essential news, obviously. But to us, lesser kind of easily seduced by such things, we might regard that as lesser news or not news at all, and more in the bracket of maybe gossip. So there is obviously a selection process that takes place here, and I'm curious to know what it is.
If only I knew. I think I'm with this work. I think I'm at the start of something rather than at the end. I mean, the internet is just obviously so huge. There are so many possible topics. The reason I chose the Daily Mail Love Island one was partly. I'm intrigued by it because it is packaged as news, albeit kind of gossipy news, but it comes from a news website, and the dynamic in which news now plays out online is that that you need to harvest the clicks. You've got to get somebody to click on it, and so this type of stuff is packaged up as kind of pseudo news, but of course it is entertainment. So it's news the entertainment and news has become blurred, and the boundaries have become blurred because every headline has got to earn its place on the page. It's got to tempt you to click through, and so that's now the dynamic that plays out. But also, I think more widely in the context of what if this is who we are, I think Love Island is just a classic example of where we're kind of so conflicted in a way between something that's kind of gossipy and problematic in some ways, shall we say, potentially, but people love it as well, and it's just an inherent contradiction, and particularly being on the Daily Mail website with their particular editorial stance. It just seemed like something that I wanted to kind of investigate further and offer back up and invite some responses again.
So how do you think the different elements that you kind of alighted on, how do you think they speak to each other? Or how would you like them to speak to each other?
I think that's a really interesting point. I'm not sure that each of these different elements directly speak to each other, but I think the sum is greater than the parts in that the different modes of presentation, the vinyl, the way that kind of has potentially a little bit of a New York Times Square ticker tape type feel, or teletext, the ticker experience, but then you've got the streams coming down and then the video tape. They all offer up multiple different experiences, which I think maybe is how the internet is. There are multiple different options there, but I'm not sure. I think hopefully in that intangible way they add up to something, but I don't think directly anyone is speaking to anyone other.
But they're in the same room, so they are.
Yes, yeah, they're not there. Yes, I didn't have that in mind. I think they're all mapping it. I sometimes think,
maybe I should rephrase the question. When you were making this work, did you conceive of it as a single exhibition, or are they individual elements that came about in their own way that then you decided to sort of editorially bring together?
Yeah, definitely a little bit of both. I think some of my work, or I think of my work, another way to think about it is like plumbing the depths, like kind of sonar at the ocean floor. You send down a line and you see how long it is before the reflection comes back. You're mapping out this kind of unknown territory. So each of these is a little dip into the ocean to map out a different part of it. And so they're the very first attempts to kind of map out parts of the internet. So in putting them together, they were conceived individually, but the more I started to think about them, and in conversation with you as well, I think, as I was doing them over the last 12, 18 months, starting to think about how they are all responses to this kind of terra incognito, or it's in our face, but trying to map it is possibly one way.
So, what would you say that you're trying to represent with these pieces? I mean, are they adding up to a single, an overall representation, or are there representations you are trying to kind of elicit through the individual works?
I think each one is a different facet of the whole. So they work individually.
Okay. So take one individually, and I'm just curious to know I know what you're presenting.
Yeah.
But what are you representing, or what are you hoping to represent?
I'm trying to make apparent that which I think has become almost like wallpaper to our lives now, and is around us. It's on our phones. We're surrounded by it, but I think we've become almost not blind to it, but we take it for granted so much. We don't realise quite how much of an influence it's having. So it's an attempt to make it apparent again, I think.
To make visible what we no longer see, because it's just so present.
Yes.
Yeah. So in that regard, you do that almost exclusively through language. So my next question is, how do you see your use of language in the history of language being used in art? I mean, I've just listed some random artists: Weiner, Kossuth, Richet, Holzer, Wall, Naumann, Kruger. I mean, we all know them. There is a kind of history there, and I'm curious to know whether you feel you belong to that, and in which case, how, and how do you see your relationship to that history?
Yeah, I think that this has been a really interesting thing to think about. I think different artists in the past have grappled with text with different agendas, and so Kossuth, for example, is maybe the possibilities and limitations of language and definition and so on, and then others have worked more along the political lines. I think my starting point, or a couple of reference points, would be Kenneth Goldsmith's uncreative writing, in which he is saying we've got enough words, we just need to offer them back and find the poetics or the rhythms in them. We don't need to make so much with them now, but we just need to make apparent. I think so. That's definitely one touchstone. I'm a big fan of John Baldessari as well, who used text but in a playful way, and in a way that kind of resisted the kind of urgency. I mean, for example, Bob and Roberta Smith. There's a great humour to it, but there's a latent anger, and beneath the surface, it's boiling away. And I don't have that anger so much. But I funnily enough though, so a lot of artists use words politically and to reflect back the power structures. I'm not really doing that so much, although inevitably it does involve some of that. Having said that, one of the recent animations that I've done, which isn't in this show, called Legitimate Interest, is probably the closest I've come to something that's more overtly political. And it's an animation based on when you have to accept cookies before you can go to a news site, and you have this really frustrating pop-up window and accept all the cookies. But if you actually navigate through that little thing that they're inviting you to accept, there are literally hundreds of advertising agencies that you are accepting without so that was a piece of work that again wanted to make apparent, but also I was cross when I was making that, and it's a slightly more maybe not aggressive, but it's a more focused and heated piece of work, I think, whereas these are much more potentially benign. I use the word zen. There's a kind of an externalization to them, and to me there's a letting go, whereas that other piece of work there's a more of an engagement in it.
Well, there is until you read it.
Yes.
It starts to punch you in the face a bit, doesn't it?
It does, and that's true. But in a way, for me at least, it's my way of freezing it and inoculating myself against it. It kind of loses its potency once I've taken it out of the online environment. Once I've stopped, the online environment from constantly bombarding me, and instead freezing it in time, placing it there, and then I can walk away from it. For me, I find that quite a positive thing.
So is it purely a selection process, or is there more going on in terms of editorial intervention?
There's selection, and then there is a little bit of curation. I struggle to have a completely random approach to things, and I don't mind admitting that. So I struggle with random in my work. So I do have a little bit of a hand on the tiller rather than just completely set up the rules of the game and then just let it go.
So just taking an example, this ticker tape running around the room.
Sure.
Is that is each sentence as it was found, or do you rearrange them? And are the sentences clipped and cut in any way? Or?
So that's a good example. So all of these, I haven't changed any of the wording,
right.
But they were all the rules of the game were that they were all prefaced by coronavirus :
right.
and then whatever follows that. So the news alert would be coronavirus : and then whatever comes. But then having said that, this is a small subset, so this is probably like 2 weeks. It goes from one of the very first ones, Foreign Office warns all Britons to leave China, and then it goes round to... I'll talk about the last one in a second, because that actually really comes on to exactly what I mean. So, right. But if I had just done them exactly as they come out, they were a little boring, or
right.
So I chose ones that I wanted to somehow articulate back the unfolding narrative. So having just said that I'm not interested in narrative, I am selecting them to kind of have the coronavirus story unfolding. So I hop from one pebble to the next, which then moves the story along. My frustration was, you were talking about the very last one. I actually wanted the very last one which the very last one currently says, what does COVID-19 do to the, and it's going to say body, but it runs off the screen. I actually wanted it to be brawl erupts over toilet paper shortage, because that seemed to me like a nice note on which to end, but that's my kind of humour, and humour to me is an important response. But also that shows my curation in it all. It's not a purely random thing. Frustratingly, I didn't quite get to do that, but it should end with a brawl over toilet paper, which again, to me, kind of summarises what if this is who we are. Here we are in the middle of a pandemic and we're all fighting over toilet paper. There's something about maybe that is who we are.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I think it feels a lot more tightly curated than you initially conceived, in terms of selection and in terms of presentation.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I am. Yes.
I mean, we had conversations about how it should look, and they were kind of. It was important. They were important decisions. I mean, they weren't random choices.
No,
they were considered choices.
And I would defend that. I mean, in the kind of the role of the artist, that's hopefully what you're bringing to the party is your take on things. And there is no neutral, and this is my take. So on the one hand, yes, it is setting up systems and structures and letting them go and see where they go. But then when the results come in, I think, well, actually, hang on a second, little tweak here and there, just to yes, exactly. And that's a different. And I struggle with that because am I then, not being true to what I'm trying to do? But so yeah. Anyway, that's a fair comment.
Okay. I mean, I don't want to push too hard, but do you see yourself as part of this use of language as a historical lineage, or is it? I mean, I know for myself, for example, that I don't feel I'm part of that history. It just feels to me that language happens to be something I'm using at this moment, and I don't really look at those artists and think I belong to that. But I just wonder if you do in a different way.
That's a good point. I think I am interested in language for its own sake, and maybe in other pieces of work I will kind of wrestle a little bit more with the specifics of language and the limitations of language. Not so much here, but definitely language is, on the one hand, it's the best we've got. We're communicating pretty well, and yet kind of lived experience begins when we stop talking and just experience and so on, or that interaction. And we know all about that. So the frustrations and the limitations and the slippages of language do interest me, and they come out more strongly in some pieces of work and not so much in others. But you're right, I think it's not language itself which is my agenda.
Yeah.
It's how language maps onto or is a vehicle for what we think and feel and how the world is.
Yeah, no, I mean that's how it feels to me. But, but I was just kind of wanted to just nail it a little bit more. Okay, so shifting the conversation a little bit now. I know you reasonably well, and I know that you're very adept at being digitally savvy. You can write code and all that kind of stuff. And all of this work refers to our digital online experience, and yet you present it almost exclusively in an analog form. And I am curious as to why that might be, and whether there's a touch of Luddite involved here, or whether it's something more of an agenda that you want to kind of speak about in a different way.
Well, no, this is interesting. I definitely don't see myself as being a Luddite.
I know you don't.
No, but so okay. Well, few things there. So yes, I do have a background in IT and programming, so I do have a facility with it. But I would stress that actually I'm way off the pace now in terms of the cutting edge of technology. So my skills are limited, but in a way that suits me because I don't think I need to be kind of doing more than I do. But the more general point about doing it in analog form is really to take it away off the internet, take it out of that sphere, and present it in a way that is more accessible to us as humans rather than as digital beings. And so I think that's the reasoning for doing that. And I could never exist. Although I do a lot of my work digitally and I'm interested in digital stuff, I really, the more I think about it, I would never want to make all my work just digital work or have it online and that be it. There's something about the physical, and that goes back to this dynamic between books and bytes and between analog and digital. There is that tactile quality to stuff that I think we can more easily assimilate and make sense of than the digital environment. So
how do you feel about artists who work, I think, very successfully and critically within the entirely the digital world? I'm thinking, people that you all know, like maybe Ed Atkins Hawkins or Rachel McLean or Alan Ball. You know, we know these artists, and I have a great deal of respect, and because I'm not savvy in terms of being technically able, I'm also in awe of these artists. You know, I'm curious as to how it's done. Maybe that awe doesn't exist for you because you probably have a sneaking knowledge of what they're up to. I don't know. But I'm wondering how you feel about their work and your work in relationship to their work.
Yeah, no, I am in awe of it because likewise I don't know how it's done, and that is a good example of how my ability, my skill set with technology is fairly limited. Okay, I can spew some stuff out on the printer, I can do some text going along a monitor, but it's fairly kind of lo-fi compared to what technology can do these days, and it's getting more advanced all the time. So I'm likewise in awe, but in a way, that kind of lo-fi approach again is this gear change that I think I'm probably after, as my way of slowing things down, externalizing them, saying, "Whoa, hang on a second, let's just hold up a second and see what we've got here." That's maybe suitable for me, whereas if I were doing it with more sophisticated tech skills, then maybe that would be lost. But no, I love it too, but also I'd say there's something about the tangible that I want to that's the move that I want to make, but not in a backwards way. I love technology, but it's a way of, again, making sense of it or bringing it into the sphere of looking at it and seeing what it amounts to.
You kind of answered my next question a little bit, but maybe, which basically was, how do you find the space, time, how do you create that for contemplation? But you kind of talked about that. So maybe you could talk about that specifically in relationship to one piece. And just go a bit further and drill down a bit further into that idea of slowing things down, which is something that we try to do in our joint project at Cable Depot. So I don't know, you choose one.
Yeah, well, one of the ones I haven't talked about, so I've got over on the corner over there, I've got a printer, and it's taking the news feed from 100 different online news sources like the BBC and the New York Times and Russia Today and Al Jazeera and whatever, and it collates all their breaking news headlines, and then it kind of spews them out. Now, in a way, that kind of slows it down, and just by kind of chucking it on the floor, it's the current equivalent of, in the old days, they used to say that today's news is tomorrow's fish and chip paper. There's the sense in which it's kind of disposable news that just keeps on splurging out. So that's slowed it down, and that's in a way, going back to kind of feeling positive or negative, I think that in a way is the most negative of them all, because it is just chucking stuff out onto the floor and consuming resources and nobody's reading it. So that's quite a bleak way of thinking about it. But in terms of slowing down the time, actually, that should be churning out at 100 pages a second, to be in real time. In fact, you probably couldn't keep up with the true volume of data at all. So I think that's interesting as well, because we as humans, we operate probably more in that analog. We can only process at a certain rate. We can only consume at a certain rate, whereas the internet and AI and so on is just chucking it out at a rate and a volume that we can no longer comprehend. So slowing it down and maybe only having one every couple of minutes is sufficient to ask the questions.
That sort of it's a nice sort of segue into the next question, which is, in a way, almost everything that you're dealing with is of the now. It's of the moment. I mean, that's the nature of what news is supposed to be. And it begs a philosophical question as to how close to now can we actually get before it's past, and without going down that kind of rabbit hole. What I'm curious about is, how close do you think you can represent now? I mean, what is now for you, given that what you've just described there, for example.
Yeah, well, I think we've probably moved to the point where it's not possible anymore. I mean, when you just watch the 9 o'clock news at night and then you've got the paper in the morning, the paper used to be now for 24 hours till the next one came the next day. And that was it. And before that, you know, it was like, you know, how fast can a horse travel? You know, you've got that news is current until the next mule train comes along, or, you know, or the next runner from marathon. You know, there was a period in time in which that was the kind of lived present. Even though stuff was happening, you couldn't access it. Whereas now it's gone so far the other extreme that you there it goes again, you simply can't keep up with it. So it's become impossible. And I think this is interesting as well in where we are. I was thinking about this today. Maybe there's a parallel with something along the lines of science and where we've got to with science. You know, maybe 100 years ago, you can get your head around protons and electrons going around them, and that's kind of comprehensible, you know, as a Newtonian system or a mechanical system. But now having to think in terms of, you know, 15 dimensions and stuff that's, you know, only lasts a trillionth of a second, or, you know, stuff has become of a scale and of a speed and of a complexity and of a nature that is actually no longer part of what we can probably we're hardwired to really comprehend, maybe.
So the disturbing thing about what you've just said is that the only way we can understand now scientifically is Brian Cox.
Other presenters are available.
Yeah, no, they are. Yeah. But on a more serious note, that idea of trying to kind of locate now is obviously impossible. And what I sense from what you're doing is, even though I feel like you're kind of pushing back a little bit on it, is that there is a kind of archive going on, or it's archival in the sense it's an archival of the Museum of Now in a weird sort of way. And I just wonder if that's what you feel, if that's a fair... Otherwise, what is it you're representing? I mean, how does one represent now? If it's not in an archival form, can it be done even?
I think it's a bit like your earlier question about cataloguing. It falls short of a catalogue, partly because it's too vast to do, but partly because it's not a complete record, and partly because it's too kind of quirky. I think more it's a reflection of kind of that absurdity, or the, you know, these paradoxes that there are. It's trying to capture that sense of our relation to it, rather than the content as such. Each of these is a single instance, but they're all kind of, they have that slight, hopefully a slight absurdity, a slight humour, and a slight, you know, that kind of frustration, or the, you know, it points up our own limits in relation to the material, rather than a catalogue as such.
Okay. I'm going to move on to the piece behind you here, the Google Oval piece. Well, it's sort of, in a way, to me, this reminded me, maybe because I was just reading about Brutus at the time, of a painting he did, which is Museum Muse, and this is Google Oval. And thinking about Brutus's Museum Moderne, I'm wondering if you see this in us as a kind of similar thing going on?
I am interested in the whole concept of museums, and I think that's really interesting, and I've kind of touched on little aspects of it in the past in work that I've done. It's maybe not so much a museum in this case, unless the Tate happens to buy it and collect it.
Well, it was a long time before Museum Moderne was acquired.
Yeah, there's still hope. But I mean, the thing is, there are so many different facets to this move to the online environment, and I've only just started to scratch the surface. So I think that's definitely something, you know, one of the many possible avenues for the future, I think, in terms of it.
Staying with it a bit, it strikes me that and the animation are the only use of colour exhibition. Are you afraid of colour? Who's
There
afraid of
are-
colour?
There are
There's
colour
colour
pens, but yeah, no, I think this is an interesting one, and so the ogles, those are all the corporate colours of Google. So that's just the last 4 letters of Google in the corporate colours. I've resisted colour partly because in my attempt to get back to the essence of things, I talked about not wanting to do things for a narrative, or I wanted to kind of boil things down to their essence. Anything that's extraneous kind of gets ditched. So colour, or the flip side is I need to know what is colour bringing to the party. So obviously here those are the Google corporate colours, the pegs are the Google corporate colours. But otherwise, I mean, we don't read, when we read a novel, the text is in black and white. It'd be quite interesting actually if the text was in colour, but it's not. So it's been a process of boiling it down to the very essence, in a way for me to kind of work out what it is that I'm working with. But funnily enough, just in the last couple of months, I'm now thinking, okay, and partly this project as well, an opportunity to build back up. Okay, well, what if they were in colour? What if I used colour now? What if, the spectacle? So I'm thinking now that I've boiled it down to the essence. Now I've got my nuggets, my text as material. Now I'm quite excited to test drive it using things like colour. These are kind of spectacles in a way. They're kind of, and provide people with an extra layer. But now I know why I'm doing it, whereas before it seemed like a distraction.
I mean, one way of countering that is that online, or writing on a keyboard as opposed to handwriting, is that the use of background colour or coloured text or fonts are instantaneous. There's no essence in a way available. It doesn't exist. It's well, apart from the list that Word provides you. So in a way, I could imagine this being the very opposite, actually, and an excess of colour and font, and almost like a mess, a visual mess. I suspect you'll never go down that road because I know your kind of process a bit more. But I wonder how you feel about that. I remember going to the museum, Brooklyn Museum, last time when I was in New York, which was pre-pandemic anyway. And I don't know if you've ever been there, but they've, for the main collection, they've revamped it as if you're walking through an online experience. So the walls are constantly changing colours.
Wow.
And there's text on them. I mean, not constantly changing as in projected. I mean, they're being painted, but it looks like you could just swipe. It's got that sense of potential change. And then they have the text like kind of that would have been lit on a plaque, blown up big on the wall, or quotes. And they've also kind of completely hung it in a way, in that kind of postmodernist or Tate modern way, where there's no kind of chronological order. So you'll have a 19th century painting next to a contemporary piece. It's exciting in a kind of fizzy sort of immediate way, but it's also chaotic. But I just wonder, that is an online experience. You could argue that is an online experience. So I'm just wondering.
So well, I think what I now kind of got to grips with finally is that so if I were to introduce something like colour or a different font or something, or play with some of those elements, before that would have felt kind of random or arbitrary, or it seems to be detracting from the offer that I'm making. Whereas now I'm thinking that well the text is there, that's the offer, but now how do I almost package it up so that it's engaging, or that people stay with it longer, or that it asks more questions of it. And so almost putting in something contradictory within it invites further responses, and I suppose that's self-evident, or it shouldn't have taken me this long to kind of realise it, but I needed to kind of get to the essence before then building it back up, whereas otherwise it just felt too arbitrary. I couldn't see what I was wanting, why the choice was being made. So I suppose it goes back to also systems and process and so on. So I would now set in place, if I were going to use more colour, I would be thinking about it with a specific purpose in mind, but then I'd feel much more comfortable about setting up those dynamics in a way that before I was kind of stripping everything back. So kind of watch this space. I definitely think I will start to use more colour and more spectacle or visual content. I mean, funny enough, this and the washing line project that we worked on, this kind of precipitated that, because to begin with I thought, my work doesn't hang, it doesn't belong on a washing line, but actually when I put it hanging like this and was forced to use this different means of representation or presentation, actually then I saw, okay, I haven't lost the essence of what I wanted, but I have gained from the presentation. And so that stayed with me, and it's definitely something that I want to pursue further.
I mean, it's just staying with this idea of colour and spectacle, I think one of the things that I'm beginning, having sat here for a while now and sort of taken it in, is it your take on the contemporary buzz of online is actually aesthetically quite a 1970s conceptual aesthetic.
It is.
It's very text-laden and predominantly monochrome, the occasional bit of colour, because colour back in the 70s was expensive to reproduce. So it has a certain quality to it that is specific to another time in a way. Are you conscious of that?
I am, and I think that's probably just how I'm wired. If I do something slightly differently, then I have to kind of slightly align it back into that kind of minimalist aesthetic, or rather, the minimalist aesthetic seems to be something that just is the way that it seems to come naturally to me together, and again doesn't detract. It allows the content to have its say in a minimally distracting way, or if I am going to beef up the distraction, it's for a reason or a purpose within it.
Talking of minimalism but beefing it up, this piece here.
Yes.
This is the only piece that's non-linguistic. Do you want to sort of say something about that?
So this is animation that's pure colour, and this came about because I was thinking about the antidote to all of this text and the monochrome and everything, and somebody was asking me, well, what is the answer to it? Well, of course the answer is to go for a walk. The answer is not to kind of sit in front of your screen with an animation, but it's based on, I did an animation around a 25 rectangle grid, which was firing these headlines in a very disconcerting way, in a monochrome way, and I wanted to change each element to try and find something that was more restful. So first of all, I got rid of the text, and that was immediately more restful because I didn't have to think about what I was being invited to process. And then the colours just changing were again much softer than the monochrome, which is very harsh. And then I slowed it down because the texts were pinging at a rate of several a second, which is very anxiety inducing. Whereas this has been slowed down to a rate, and I bet, I've only just started doing this, but I'm going to play around with more of these. I bet the optimum refresh rate for this probably corresponds to your heartbeat when you're kind of relaxed and refreshed, So it's the same as like ASMR. It's kind of that slow, calming, restful.
Screensaver.
And then we were talking about it being a screensaver, because I was thinking maybe this doesn't belong in this exhibition because it's the opposite of everything else, but thought of as a screensaver and being a barrier to what's behind it. If you got rid of that, in order to access the internet, you get rid of the calm, quiet, composed element. So it's operating as a screensaver, as a barrier. And maybe as an intermediary between us and our love of colour and delight and pleasure and aesthetics, and the kind of big bad digital world behind it.
Bad digital world?
Oh yes, morally neutral digital world behind us.
I mean, it does sort of sit with a different register to everything else, I think. One of the things that I kind of immediately felt about it is that because it has no language, because it is purely an abstract colour grid aesthetic, there's that notion of what Derrida refers to as poetic excess. You can't reduce it to a specific meaning, which in a way plays up by contrast the functionality of the rest of the show. And I'm wondering how you feel about that dichotomy or relationship.
Exactly.
Dynamic.
No, I think that's absolutely right. In that all of this is terribly functional and terribly kind of logical and ordered or whatever, and it plays to a certain sensibility within us. And I do think there's in many ways a diametric opposite. So it does have a poetic, unresolved quality to it, which is comes from a different place, definitely, I think.
So how do you feel about your practice in general in relationship to this? I hate kind of using the term, but let's call it the poetic, for want of a better one. That idea of something that's not easy, not irreducible. That's not kind of explicable. There's something left behind,
Yeah.
Do you worry about that or think about that? Does that play a role in the thought process?
There's always an irreducible other. There's always something left over. No matter how much we try to get to the bottom of something and drill down and present things and deal with facts or whatever, or objectivity, there's always an irreducible remainder left over. And that is where then the imagination kicks in. That's the kind of grit in the oyster, the element that's never resolved. And that is, I think, I try and look for that, or maybe not always. I'm always mindful of that, and that's often the point at which a work can tip when you've got the material, but then it's tipping around the fact that something's left out of it, and so that kind of relates to ideas of absurdity as well, where the word absurd. I mean, absurd I think is in numerical terms is something that is irreducible. It's not. Okay. It's an infinite number of decimals. It never ends. You cannot resolve it. So there's a sense in which it's irresolvable, irreducible. And that's probably as close I get to a kind of poetic in what I'm doing. There's a leftover.
But you would acknowledge that the two are operating on very different.
Yeah, whereas that one is much more. That is much more a kind of straight up kind of poetic, as it were. So, and I think just very briefly and finally, thinking about colour and what we were saying, is that but now I'm more mindful of this dynamic between the two, and now I have got this kind of crunchy, very objective, very fact-based material. I can put it through the grind, the poetic grinder, and see how they perform in mashing those two elements together. I think that's definitely something for the future.
I mean, that may be an answer to the next question, but we'll see. Which is, once you've chosen the criteria of whatever it's going to be, or the subject that you're going to investigate, what's the criteria by which you choose that form of representation? Because there's some quite interesting choices at work here. And the most obvious one that I want to kind of use as an example is the teleprinter on the other side of the monitor.
The video, yes.
For the Daily Mail's Love Island feed. But you're using a language to somebody of my generation, our generation, of watching football results on a Saturday afternoon. It's got that kind of very 1970s sense about it. So how did you alight on that system of representation for that topic?
Again, it's kind of slight kind of happenstance in a way. There's I was trying to develop the programming to be able to do it, and I was thinking, well, what effects can I generate? And I've got now a library of different effects that I can do with my Python code, and not all of them have seen the light of day yet. I've got another one. You remember in Liverpool Street Station, you used to have these ticker based display boards, and they would tick around each one, and you get the train details, and you go, and you get another one. It's in the Bourne.
They make a racket.
And they're great, yeah. So that's another one that I can do. So so there's a sense of kind of trying to make these effects, but then specifically with the Vidi printer one, in the early days, that was always hot off the press. This was the stuff that was coming off, but it was always kind of if you saw something on there, it would be fact. It would be important stuff. I mean, obviously, football results, well, they were important if you were doing the pools or something, but that would be the important thing. So it was a chance to juxtapose that with the banality of the Love Island material.
But why specifically that juxtaposition?
That I will admit there is an element of slightly arbitrariness to it. I've got different modes of presentation. The viral one has had another life as an online digital, so the same material has been used in an online digital animation. So I'd love to say that I use that as bespoke. That could not the Love Island material could not be shown in any other way,
right.
But actually it probably could, and I'm probably still working out what that relationship is.
Because the follow-up question to that is the role of nostalgia in your work. Because despite the fact that it's the heat of the now, a method of representation like that kind of tweaks nostalgic, parts of the brain, and I wonder whether that's something you kind of wanted, or what role it plays in your decision making.
This is a really good question, and actually one of the reasons that I resisted using a monitor like that for so long was because I didn't want to play the nostalgia card, and it's very tempting to have old tech and to have it looking like that, and there's something alluring about it, but it can be fatal in an artwork just to kind of go for the nostalgia button. But actually, I got a long way with this, because I do a little podcast, and I was interviewing, I was having a conversation a bit like this with Philip Harris, who does analogue cine film and film processes in a digital age, and I was saying, is this just a nostalgia trip? And he's saying no. He again totally gets it. It's a very tempting thing, and of course there is nostalgia to it, but the reason that he uses it, he wants to again slow things down and point up the different approaches and what the different almost the craft element that was apparent in his photography before digital age. So it's a way of, again, it's slowing things down and externalizing it and trying to think about, what anything beyond that is actually adding to it.
Is that your way of attempting the contemporaneous as opposed to the contemporary?
You keep asking me this, and I always slightly. So, keeping up to date, bang up to date, is kind of how I'm thinking about this, and I can't keep bang up to date. I know that. My only real answer to this, and it's not really an answer, but just an offering really, is that my own progression in my artwork and my thinking about artwork and the choice of subjects, I start, because I'm kind of largely self-taught, although I then did do a master's, and when I was starting out, my first hero, I can't believe that this is true, but it is, my first hero was Raphael, and I kind of worked my way through all the Renaissance, and then I kind of worked my way up to, my next one was Monet, and they're kind of, they're very vanilla, but actually, in themselves, they are...
How long did this process take?
Well, decades. And I finally caught up with them now, but at each stopping off point, I had to immerse myself in that whole era, and it wasn't, and so I had my fix of the Impressionists, and then I moved on, and so on. And I spent a long time grappling with the 60s and 70s, and perhaps I'm still there, but so I'm only gradually coming up to the present, And I think that doesn't answer a question, but it's just an observation really about my own catching up really, or thinking through everything.
Maybe that's what this is really about.
Well, maybe
that sense of always feeling you're behind the curve, which with technology, unless you're 15 years old, you pretty much are really, you know.
And the whole concept of the avant-garde, you know, why you have to constantly remake something or try and be one step ahead, or kind of, you know, as soon as society catches up, we've got to, you know, we've got to do something new, or we've got to kind of take another twist and so on. And why there is this constant urge to move forwards, I think, is a really interesting question. And I was thinking the other day, you know, the phrase no pain, no gain. Well, if you flip that around, no gain, no pain, you know, in other words, if you stop trying to keep gaining, stop trying to keep on the hamster wheel of newness and nowness and contemporaneity, you know, you potentially stop the pain as well. You know, why don't we stop? Why don't we stick with what we've got? We've got plenty.
You might be forced to.
But we don't. We keep on. It's just a never-ending, as things are. That's
capitalism, isn't it?
That's another discussion.
Okay, we've been chatting for an hour. Shall we open it up?
Please do. Questions? Yes. If anybody would like to ask any questions, please feel free.
Covered it pretty well.
I have a comment which perhaps you can turn into a question for me. You talked about the fact that the newspaper used to be the now 24-hour cut-off. There's printing of it out there, distributed and read it. Now the news is happening like this. I've seen the opposite happening, that the newspaper is now a delayed printout of a selection of these lines, and the selection varies, and it varies in its age. So today's newspaper contains stories that were online 3 or 4 days ago, and ones that only appeared yesterday, and yet they remain that snapshot now. How does that affect your view of print against IT, shall we say?
That is very interesting. Yeah. So the newspaper format is really struggling, isn't it? Because it can no longer keep up. It's by almost definition it's out of date immediately compared to the online digital world, and so I think maybe part of the issues that is news as entertainment. So they're selecting those bits that are going to sell. You know, your free newspaper that you take on your commute has got to entertain as much as to inform, because you've already heard the radio and you know more than what's in the paper. So it's an entertainment as well. And I think that's part of the problems that we've got into with fake news and so on, and the news agenda, because it has to do more than just inform. It has to some extent, that's always been the case. You know, there's always been.
I think with newspapers, they've become much more platforms for opinion and interpretation. But you think? So, I mean, maybe it's a generational thing, but I tend to read a paper because I'm curious about what certain journalists are going to contribute. I don't read it for the news, really. I mean, the news is just, I get from all these other sources. The interpretation of that news might be interesting. Do you see what I'm saying? So there's a way in which I think the print newspaper is probably doing something different from what it did once upon a time. I don't know.
Oh, I'm sure. But the news almost has become more elusive. Although obviously it had to meet a 24-hour deadline. So news from far away in the world, which was days old by the time it got to London and so on. So once it was there, it was printed. It's in the British Library newspaper collection and so on. But now, what actually is the news? You almost can't grasp whether it's on paper, or whether it's coming.
Well, I think what qualifies as news is much more fungible than it's ever been. And that whole kind of fake news and news and who decides what is news has just become very contested.
And the idea that news was words, news is what's hanging behind you.
Yeah.
That's our say, my old generation,
Yes, exactly.
reading a newspaper.
Yeah.
Whereas in news long ago, well, from Pathé News, it became a weekly newsreel.
Yeah.
That was behind the times.
Mm.
Now what comes on the screen is shot from people's mobile phones while the police helicopter is landing.
No, that's absolutely true. Although I think, interestingly, Pathé News, I see far more of it as of clips online now than I ever did, when I was growing up. Not that Pathé News was how one got the news when I was growing up. I'm not that old, but it's as a kind of archive of events from a bygone era. Pathé News is now, because it can be digitised and put up online, is suddenly got a currency, ironically, that it hadn't had for probably 50 years or whatever. So yeah, there's a curious sort of turn of the wheel there, isn't there?
Mm.
What do words capture? What's the beauty of words capture?
Yeah.
Words capture.
Or not. Is there anything I missed out that you wanted to say?
No, I think thank you very much for taking the time to give me
pleasure.
a grilling and to
I
inquire.
didn't feel it was.
No, but to inquire about what I've been up to, and I hope it kind of provides a little bit of an insight into what I'm trying to. If I knew what I was doing, it's that same thing. You do it in order to try and understand yourself, and it's only with hindsight and that you start to make sense of it. So this is really helpful for me to actually try and understand what it is that I've been beavering away at.
It's been interesting to think about. Good.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone.